Welcome everyone to the third episode of the Fired Up and Plugged In podcast powered by Emergency Reporting. This is the podcast for all 21st century fire and EMS personnel. I'm Tom Lewis, Enterprise Training Manager and the podcast producer. Our topic today is community risk reduction and the power of a program that enhances the safety of all community citizens. Joining us is retired Fire Chief Randy Bruegman. During his 40-year career in local government, Chief Bruegman was the president of the International Association of Fire Chiefs in 2002 to 2003, and also served as the president of the board of directors of the Center for Public Safety Excellence from 2004 to 2017. We at Emergency Reporting are grateful to have him as a member of our Customer Advisory Board. Our special guest today is Joe Powers, Deputy Chief of Community Risk Reduction for the Charlottesville Fire Department in Virginia. You might say he's a powerhouse when it comes to progressive community risk reduction for his department. He'll be sharing his successes, challenges, and a wealth of ideas for creating a truly world-class program for keeping a community safe. So thanks for being with us today, and let's start the podcast. Chief Bruegman.
Well, good day, everyone, and welcome back to another session of Fired Up and Plugged In. And today, it's really an honor to have Chief Joe Powers from Charlottesville Fire Department of Virginia on the show today, and we're going to explore a little bit about community risk reduction. Chief Powers has been really a force driving community risk reduction, not only within the city of Charlottesville, but nationally as well. And so we wanted to just have him on today and just kind of explore, how as he migrated into Charlottesville, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but how he has engaged the entire department and the entire community in this focused effort. So welcome, Chief Powers. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you having me here, and I feel like I probably should send you a check for all the nice things you just said about me.
Okay, I'll send you my address later.
Perfect. Yeah.
But let's just start today by why don't you just tell everybody that's listening in the audience a little bit about yourself, because you didn't start in Charlottesville. So what's your background?
Yeah, so I've kind of had an interesting background, and I'll go back a little bit. So I moved around a lot as a kid. I was born in Florida, grew up in Alaska, went to Washington State, but I made it to Virginia in the middle of high school by way of the West Coast. And I found the fire service in rural central Virginia as a great opportunity for a kid looking for something to do. And that passion for the fire service and really emergency services followed me into college. And coming out of college, I found that there was an internship with the Henrico County Division of Fire, which is outside of Richmond, Virginia, kind of the metro area of Richmond. So I did a great internship with that department. I actually ended up getting hired and spent almost 20 years as a professional firefighter there. I had this really interesting career, and I attributed a lot to a now retired battalion chief that gave me some advice. He's like, listen, the fire service can really make you into a great storyteller at a bar, or if you take the opportunities that are in front of you, it can make you into something really, really great. So I've kind of lived by that professionally. When I see an opportunity pop up, it takes me out of my comfort zone, and I kind of jump on it. And you can't try new things without saying yes to some stuff that pops up. So I spent a long time as a firefighter paramedic on an engine company. I went to a law enforcement academy, was a fire investigator with the fire marshal's office. I was the chief's project manager. I did strategic planning. I was the accreditation manager. I spent some time on the command team and operations. And I was always had this passion for, why is it that we're doing the things that we're doing if the community needs something differently? And that's where, early in the 2000s, when I was an inspector building programs for to meet the needs of the inspections that we were seeing, I think that's where community risk reduction really started with me, and I took it on throughout my career. And back in January of 2020, just a year ago, prior to COVID, if anybody remembers what that was like, that's when I came to the city of Charlottesville. They had posted a job opening for the first deputy chief of community risk reduction with the department, and that's how I got here.
Yeah, interesting background. So, I mean, when you first came across community risk reduction, what drew you in? Why did you acclimate so quickly to that concept?
So I think in 2002 or 2003, we were seeing the same problems occurring during business inspections. So I said, this is crazy that we continue to see this. Why don't we put a training program together that focuses in on the problems that we're seeing? And we deployed it, and it essentially fixed our problems. From a selfish side, we were trying not to continually go back to the same businesses and have these same conversations. So quarterly we put this program together, and it worked out really well for our office, and it worked out really well for the business community and big box stores and things like that. Fast forward into 2014, 2015, we had unfortunately we had a year of high fire deaths in the Richmond area, and our fire chief said, "Hey man, every house needs to have a working smoke alarm." And I was like, "That's a really great idea, but we don't have the capacity to do that." So what I did what I did with a large team of folks that really poured their heart into it is we developed a risk assessment that identified the specific homes that needed a working smoke alarm. We deployed light duty folks out to it, people that had knee injuries or back injuries, and somebody that could drive, somebody could put a smoke alarm up. All of a sudden you had a team of smoke alarm technicians they healed very quickly because they made it right back to operation. But we always had this great team of folks. But we also found that risk assessment was 92 or 93% reliable on identifying the right places to go. So all of a sudden we were doing the right things in the right places, rather than just knocking on every door in the neighborhood. We were knocking on the right 3 doors in the neighborhood. And that's what really brought me in, saying that this is the future of the fire service.
Well, thank you. So, when you left Henrico and you came to Charlottesville, and it's a pretty innovative job title, at least in today's fire service market, community risk reduction chief. Yeah. I applaud your fire chief for taking that step. I think that shows that there's a real vision within the organization about where he wishes to take it. But tell us a little bit about how you built that foundation once you got to Charlottesville for community risk reduction, because that's probably was somewhat of a challenge when I would imagine that when you first arrived.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like community risk reduction in many other fire departments, the Charlottesville Fire Department had renamed fire prevention and renamed the fire marshal's office to CRR. And when I got here, it was a traditional fire marshal's office. It was a model of fire inspectors and fire investigators that had changed the name of their section to community risk reduction, because that's kind of what we did, overall. So one of the first things that I know I needed to do was I needed to develop a game plan to get us from where we are now to where we're going. And I really called that, we coined it the CRR change plan. But really what it was building the foundation for the house that we currently lived in. We had built these programs, and we had built and we were semi-successful with a lot of these things, but they weren't sustainable because the foundations weren't built. So what I developed was what I did is I met with all of our staff individually, and I did a program or an exercise called people, positions, and programs, and it was Post-it notes. And if you know me, I'm all about really big pieces of paper and Post-it notes. So whiteboards, I've got lots of whiteboards in my office and big pieces of paper. But really, we got down to Post-it notes about you as a person. What is it that you need for professional development? How can I support you as a supervisor, obviously? And that was first for us. Then we talked very specifically about the positions. Your position as a captain, that is a inspector and an investigator. Where are the opportunities? Where are the successes? Where are the challenges? And we started to build that out. And then we looked at every program, and I gave them 8 minutes per program. So the programs that you directly interact with, and it's almost like a SWOT, but it was a little different. And we did these Post-it notes with the programs. And I took all of that from all of these individual discussions, and we built out a really robust CRR change plan, which essentially was building the foundation for all of the programs that we currently have, plus, all of the things that I need, from a risk assessment standpoint. And that's how we started to align the staff within the CRR section. Moving out of my section, community risk reduction to me is an organization-wide initiative. It's not a section, it's not a program. It really is the fire department, because that's what we do. So I started having these conversations with firefighters at kitchen tables, and I have a model of community risk reduction that I talk about a lot. That talks about the incident and the time of recovery, and if we can get those two things together, that's where we start to see those major outcomes. So eating lunches at kitchen tables, having these discussions about what community risk reduction really is, people started to realize, they're like, oh, it's not the fire marshal's office. We're just not going to do the same thing over and over again. So one of the exercises I did, I printed big maps, laid them on kitchen tables, and I had firefighters identify risks and target hazards. And I didn't define risks or target hazards. I said, hey, let's all write it down. I'll take notes. So we're a relatively small department of 10 square miles and 50,000 people. So we have 4 engine companies running out of 3 stations. So 3 stations and 3 shifts. I came out with these 9 maps, and we had maps on apparatus access only, because that's what that station decided to focus on. We had maps on vulnerable populations where the people were living that had needs. And it was a wide spectrum, and it was really amazing. And we took it and put it into a web map, and started assigning people to start to mitigate some of these things. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about why the fire department doesn't need to do it all, and we start to talk about partnerships. But once we started to understand what community risk reduction is, gather the feedback from both our internal staff and the fire department and the firefighters, then we started to get a lot of this buy-in. And then the last thing, the biggest part of coming into the Charlottesville area is saying, hey, listen, we have got to have this comprehensive risk assessment that says what it is that we need to do, and where we need to do it more specifically. And that's what we're finishing up now.
Excellent. So what was the feedback when you're sitting in the firehouse around the coffee table and you're laying these maps out? What was some of the feedback that you were receiving from the firefighters and the captains in the house?
So it was I spent a long time. I've still spent most of my career as a frontline firefighter, and I still feel like I look at from my perspective on change and decision makings. I'm always looking at it from, well, how would I feel as a firefighter, and how do I approach it from that aspect? But I think that the feedback and going into the exercise, everybody was a little, what are we talking about? But once I laid it out and I said, listen, I need you to talk to me about the city. I'm brand new to the city. I live an hour away. I came here in high school a couple times, but beyond that, I don't really know. So I need to understand what you understand. And all of a sudden, I think it really seemed like a light switch clicked on, and now they're like, oh, you're asking for our feedback. You want to know what we think. And all of a sudden, there's pouring out, and it was the biggest challenge was gathering all the things that people were saying, and getting it on the map. And people I've got these great pictures of firefighters all around this little piece of paper, or a big piece of paper on it, and they're all trying to point at the same time. So it was really well received.
Wow, that's excellent. So, we've talked a little bit in the past about, the concept that I think that you brought there, fire marshals to operations.
Yeah.
And I think in most organizations, there's always been a divide between the fire marshal's office, fire prevention bureau, and the people on the line. And it's always us and them a lot of times.
Yeah.
You do what you do, and you do what you do, and we don't cross paths. So how did you start to address that?
Yeah, so a lot of it's really difficult to build a bridge across the Grand Canyon. So either we fix it by building this huge bridge across the Grand Canyon, and I don't have the capacity with my resources to do it. So we changed the model. In spring summer of 2020, right in the middle of COVID, we had some retirements, and I had coming into the job, I had a plan for how we could reorganize when we had the opportunity to reorganize. So through a little bit of attrition with those retirements, I was able to reorganize our fire marshal's office to have one, to essentially have a battalion chief, that's the deputy fire marshal, to be on duty, Monday through Friday during normal business hours. And then I had the opportunity to bring in 3 captains for A, B, and C shift. The interesting thing is that we had a similar model in the past that didn't work at all. And going into this, I collected a lot of, I asked questions. I wanted to know why it didn't work. And then we all met together. I said, this is where the rubber meets the road. When we deploy 3 captains back to A, B, and C shift, for one, it's going to reduce my overtime budget, tremendously. It's going to reduce the amount of time that engine companies are waiting for interaction from an inspector or an investigator in the middle of the night. And we can start to integrate these positions in the other parts of the organization. But when I sat down with everybody, I said, this is where the rubber meets the road. We have to be a one team. So it's my expectation that you eat at least 2 meals a day with the station that you're assigned to, and get out to the other stations too. But at least eat 2 meals a day. The morning meetings you have to be a part of, and physical fitness and training in the morning you have to be a part of. Now that eats into the time that my inspectors and investigators need to do their things. But moving into it, a lot of the firefighters were like, this is just going to be 2.0. That's what I kept hearing. It's going to be 2.0. It's going to be the same thing, just called something differently. Yeah. But 30 days in, it wasn't 2.0. We got rid of the name of fire marshal. We call them Ops 2. We used to have a Battalion 1 and a Battalion 2. The Battalion 2 used to be the on-duty fire marshal, and that didn't work really well because there was not a lot of integration. But when we redeployed it, we didn't call them fire marshals. They're part of the command team. They do incident command on larger incidents. They're responding to fire alarms. They're doing all the things that in theory we should have been doing for a long time, but we just never had the opportunity to do it. So it's really neat that the companies have kind of done an about face and said, we love that they're here, and we don't want them to take any time off, because when they're off, then they don't have that resource immediately available. But it's turned out really, really well, bringing fire marshals back into operations, making them part of a command team. And from a succession management or succession planning standpoint, I've got 3 captains that are going to do really, really well on a battalion assessment. So I'm really looking forward to. I'm not really looking forward to losing them, but if there's an opportunity, I'd love to push them through that process.
Yeah, they'll continue that influence throughout the rest of their career. And I would imagine that some of your younger firefighters that are looking to promote up are probably seeing that also as an additional pathway. Yeah,
and there's not a lot of, especially in the city of Charlottesville, I don't think that there's been a lot of interest, to move into the fire marshal's office or into community risk reduction. But since we've made this change, I've had a couple firefighters and a couple captains come to me and say, hey, if there's ever an opening or ever an opportunity, remember me, because I would love to come help you.
So that resistance that you maybe had experienced the first 30, 60, 90 days has kind of waned off, and now you're starting to see that turnaround where you're actually getting some engagement long term.
Yeah, we're seeing our Ops 2 and our Battalion 1 sitting in the same vehicle now during command incidents. We're seeing our fire marshals out on alarms before the engine company's getting there. Not waiting for the engine company to call them. They're really starting to integrate well into operations.
That's great. So we've spoken a lot in the past about how every organization uses data just a little bit differently, and could you provide some details into how you're using data and in the organization from a community risk reduction standpoint?
Yeah, so I mean, the amount of information that's available to us is amazing, right? We have data on every structure in the city. We have data on every incident that we respond to. And the neat thing is that everything that we do as an industry, we do it somewhere, so we can tie a location to it. I'm like most firefighters, I'm a visual guy, and I like to see a picture. And I think that we can use data represented within GIS to tell a real story of what's going on, either from an operational standpoint, from a risk standpoint, from a workload standpoint. It's all visual. It's all can be visualized within a map, and we can really bring that together and start to form form a really robust risk assessment.
So I think you're using a pretty innovative approach to drive community risk reduction all the way down into the firehouse. Could you kind of share that with the audience today? Because I think it's pretty unique, and I think it's really a roadmap for what the Fire and Emergency Services needs to be doing from a national perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking at it from a risk assessment standpoint, and I want to have something that's in the hands of a company officer when they go out to do a public engagement, or they're out on the street. They can look at a risk assessment and say, well, I'm in the 10th and Page neighborhood, and I know that these are the 3 things that we need to talk about when we're running calls in this neighborhood, or when we're at a block party, or when we're at at one of the concerts on the downtown mall. We can have these conversations around what our risk assessment is really telling us. There's so much opportunity to pull in operations and to provide them the information that they need, and all of a sudden we start to see these huge outcomes and these huge opportunities for improvement, right?
You also, we've talked in the past about you're using a pretty innovative approach to how you're driving community risk reduction down into the firehouse, into the neighborhoods those firehouses are serving. So could you kind of walk us through that process that you're using and how that's working out?
Yeah, absolutely. So from a community risk assessment standpoint, we could do a risk assessment on the city, 10 square miles, including the University of Virginia. But that really, from my standpoint, that really doesn't help me much, because it doesn't allow me to understand what the real needs are. And we can also do a risk assessment based on fire department response zones. I've got 4 engine companies within the city. I could do a risk assessment on those 4 engine company response zones. But then again, the community doesn't really have input or buy into that, because the community doesn't care where the lines are drawn for engine company responses. Yeah. So one of the neat things about the city of Charlottesville, and a lot of other cities and communities are the same, there are neighborhoods and communities that are well defined within the city, and the city of Charlottesville has 19 established neighborhoods in a 10 square mile city. So they get pretty small. So what I found was that I can use these 19 neighborhoods, develop a risk assessment for each of these neighborhoods, and really start to tell the story of what's happening in the Greenbrier neighborhood, in the Venable neighborhood, or in the 10th and Page neighborhood. But what that really what that does for me, and what that does for my company officers on an engine company, is it gives them a reference point. If I'm a company officer on an engine doing a public engagement on the downtown mall during the summer, where we're walking and just and smiling and giving out stickers, there's also an opportunity to look at that risk assessment and say, hey, we're in this neighborhood. These are the 3 things that we should be talking about that's specific to here, because every street corner, every neighborhood, every community is different, right? And we can't say that everybody just needs cooking fire interaction. I know in the city of Charlottesville, there's 2 neighborhoods that require like engagement focused on cooking fires, right? But I also know that some other neighborhoods have high incidence of pedestrians being struck by vehicles. I see neighborhoods that have a huge increase in stroke and cardiovascular disease, where I don't see that in other places. So there's using the data, using the things that we have available to us, we can start to build risk assessments and really drive outcomes. One of the neat things that we did in Charlottesville is we partnered with Esri, and everybody has an understanding of what Esri can do, but when you start to dive down into some of their products, it gives you some really good things for the fire service to jump on top of. Our neighborhood risk assessment with those 19 neighborhoods is built within the Esri story map. So on the iPads in the front seats of a fire truck, on an iPhone, or a computer in the station, our company officers will now have the ability to go in, click on the neighborhood they're in, and open up all of this information that they have available to them. Esri's Community Analyst is a great tool to bring in all of this information about behaviors. How many households don't have a vehicle? How many households have internet or a smartphone? Things like that, because that really tells the story of the neighborhoods, and that's kind of where we're trying to get to. But our neighborhood risk assessment has got talks very specifically about incident rankings. Top three for provider impressions, top three for CAD responses. So what kind of calls are we going to? It talks very specifically about the engagement focus. What is it that our company officers and our firefighters should be talking about? It also hits on those considerations that it's almost like the interpretation. We know that certain neighborhoods are full of UVA students, and that the types of calls are generated because of UVA students. And when the students are out of town, we see a decrease in calls. So we mention that within those neighborhood descriptions. We're grabbing public data such as earthquakes, hurricanes, average rainfall, for areas, because all of that information, is publicly available. So let's start to bring it into a map and start to look at it. We're examining rental homes based on the owner's address. If the owner's address is different than the property address, likely it's a rental home, and likely that provides a little bit different risk. And we're able to visualize that for each of our individual neighborhoods.
So that's a really great example, because I know a lot of organizations still today are looking at, they just look at their run responses and say this is where our issues are at. They don't really know what's driving the issues. So I think from a standpoint of what's the long-term vision for community risk reduction throughout the U.S., it is really about driving down into the data points to figure out what's happening in the different segments of the community, so we can address those effectively on the front end, so that we don't have failures, on the back end, which requires us to be called.
And you make a really good point that a lot of fire departments use incident data because that's the data that they have. And I think that that's a really good first step for a risk assessment. If you have reliable data on incidents, take it and build and start to build your risk assessment. But just remember that a risk assessment doesn't have to be huge. A risk assessment is literally lots of little baby risk assessments all put together, right? We have risk assessments built for incident responses, and then we added something to it. Then we added this to it, and we continue to build it out. And all of a sudden now we have this big, robust risk assessment that drives our decisions in the city of Charlottesville.
You had mentioned a little bit earlier about some partnerships, community partnerships, and how you can achieve community risk reduction outcomes through the engagement of community partners. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So it's funny. I always say that the fire department, we're our own worst enemy, because we want to be the best fire department for the community. And we gloat that we're the best fire department for the community because we do all of these things and with little resources. But I would argue that we need to be a good enough fire department for the community, and that we don't need to solve everybody's problems, because there are people out there that solve problems really, really well for specific communities, demographics, problems. So one of the things that we did in Charlottesville early on when I first got here was take a look at the way that we approach frequent 911 utilizers. So there's a really good example of, we have a gentleman that lives in a third floor apartment. He has no legs. He's wheelchair bound. He is the nicest guy in the world. He's a retired. He's retired from the Air Force. He was a retired police officer. and is just genuinely a nice guy. But he called almost every day for 2 years to help us take him up the stairs. He can get down the stairs just fine, but getting back up the stairs, he called the fire department. Now, we did it for 2 years because we didn't have another resource for that. So one of the first things that I worked with was the frequent 911 utilizer work group, and I retooled it in the first couple of months of 2020, because I said we have got to figure out who it is that can actually start to help solve problems. So we brought in representatives from Department of Social Services, Region 10, a lot of the area nonprofits. You know, our area healthcare, because we have a big trauma center and a community hospital here in the city as well. And I brought in all of those people, and I was like, hey, listen, these are the people or the locations that we're going to most often. How can we talk individually about them and start to solve the problems? And what happened was we put people that are passionate about the community and know the resources in the community. All of a sudden, our gentleman that lives on the 3rd floor doesn't call us anymore, because there's a gym in the city of Charlottesville that caters to people with disabilities. He goes to the gym, and the deal is that, and it's a free gym. The deal is that as long as he goes to the gym and works out, they'll carry him up and down the stairs all day long, which is amazing. I mean, that's thinking outside of the box. That's not something that we knew about, and that's not something the fire department needed to fix. And you know, we were able to pull all of this workload from our operations staff, pulled it off of them, and transferred it to a more appropriate resource. So it's all about partnerships, you know, because once we establish those relationships and we start to support them with information, with data, with insight, a lot of times there's people out there that are willing to do it and have the resources to do it far more so than the fire department can ever do.
Yeah, and I think that was identified in the 21st Century Fire and Emergency Services report that you know, the fire and emergency services are in a very unique position in their community, because they're often seeing the problems firsthand. Sometimes they can't deal with them, but if we can convene others that can, bring them under our umbrella of response, and you know, and create these partnerships, we can really influence significantly some of the socioeconomic factors that are occurring in our communities that are driving our runs. And so, but we can't do it all ourselves, but we can sure get everybody to the table to help us do it.
Yeah, and it drives efficiency and decreases our workload, and that's one of those biggest side effects of community risk reduction that no one that a lot of people realize after it's happened, but don't realize up front.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation. What would you like to end up with today? What would you like to share with everybody about you know, what you're seeing? Where's the industry going to go in? Where's it going to go?
I truly believe that the industry, from a fire service standpoint, that we're always going to need the fire department, right? You know, there's always an opportunity for municipalities, local governments to have a fire department. But the funding's not always going to be there unless we show that we're a community investment. You know, right now the fire service is looked at as a community liability. We need to change that and make it and show our decision makers, show our policy makers that what the fire department's doing in the community is not just putting out fires, because we don't do that very often. You know, we do so much more, and we need to communicate that. And we can use the models of community risk reduction to go out and say, these are the things we need to impact. Let's do it in the most efficient way. And all of a sudden now there's this buy-in in, you know, funding the fire department for other things. You know, it's understanding that community risk reduction is not the fire marshal's office. The fire marshal's office may be a portion of community risk reduction, but you know, community risk reduction is not public education. And I always say it's not red plastic hats and stickers. You know, it's a coordinated effort with all of our partners to do the right thing. And I really urge people to take a minute, understand, you know, what CRR really is, and find the opportunities within your fire department to take that step outside of the box, because working within the community risk reduction field, or in that venue, or in that environment, is not comfortable until you understand what's going on. And then once you see the value in it, it'll take your fire department light years ahead with sustainable funding, sustainable people. It's really the future of the fire service.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, I mean, we're always gonna have pieces of fire equipment that respond, because emergency response is part of part of the 5 segments of community risk reduction. But
Absolutely.
I think we're going to be doing so many other things in the future to lower the community risk, and we're going to be engaged in things that we may not even see today. And I think we just have to be open to those perspectives and be willing to, you know, take a risk sometimes and step out of our normal comfort zone in our box and say, we're gonna try this and see if it works. And if it fails, you know, you fail forward and you make it better next time. So
exactly right. Yeah.
So, well, Chief, thanks so much for being with us here today and sharing your insight and expertise and knowledge about community risk reduction, and look forward to seeing what happens in Charlottesville over the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, it's going to be exciting, and thank you so much. This is a great opportunity, and I appreciate everybody listening. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you.